Jack the Giant Killer by Stirling W. Sill. Read to you by James Campbell. Some time ago I reread that very interesting old English folk tale entitled Jack the Giant Killer. In the days of King Arthur, a giant by the name of Cormoran lived on Cornwall Island, a short distance beyond Land's End. Cormoran frequently indulged in a very bad habit of wading across the intervening bit of sea, frightening the people out of their villages, and then loading himself up with their cattle, sheep, and other property to carry them back to his island. Living in the village was a young farmer boy whose name was Jack. Jack was a very resourceful, thoughtful young man, and one day he asked his father about Cormoran. Jack's father explained that nothing could be done with this problem because Cormoran was a giant and even King Arthur's knights were afraid of giants. But Jack told his father that his teacher from Salzburg had said that there was a solution to every problem. Jack believed that there was a solution to Cormoran, and he intended to find it. A few nights later, Jack put an axe, a pick, and a shovel into his boat and rowed out to the island where the giant lived. While Cormoran was asleep, Jack dug a pit in front of his cave, and just before dawn he sent a loud blast from his horn through the cave. The giant was very angry, and roaring with rage, and uttering threats of vengeance, he stumbled out through the darkness and fell into Jack's trap. Jack was on hand with his axe and gave the giant a good sound tap on the head that was hard enough to forever solve the problem of Cormoran. When the people living in the next country heard that Jack had killed the giant, they immediately invited him to come and perform a like service for them. But their giant had two heads, which required a little different handling. But Jack knew that there was a solution to every problem, and all he needed to do was to find the right answer. Jack's success at solving giant problems was soon noised abroad, and other requests began coming in. But every giant required a different answer. Some had eyes in the backs of their heads. One had a magic coat that made him invisible. One had a magic cap which enabled him to learn things no one else knew. One had a magic sword that could cut through the strongest iron. One had a pair of magic shoes that gave him extraordinary swiftness. But Jack knew that there was a solution to every problem, and when the right solution was supported with sufficient skill, courage, and industry, every problem could be solved. Finally, he was given the highly complimentary title of Jack the Giant Killer. This is far more than just a very interesting story. It is also a most worthwhile philosophy of life. Our worst difficulties arise because of our inability to properly solve our problems. As one example, we see the giant nations roaring and snarling at each other and threatening to destroy the world because they can't solve a problem. Think what a wonderful world we could have if all the giant nations would stop creating problems and develop a little greater ability as problem solvers. That might also serve as one of the primary objectives for our own individual accomplishment. We should, of course, keep in mind that all of our problems do not come from giants. The most tiny problems are often too much for some of us to solve. We frequently fail because we spend so much time worrying about the problem that we don't take time to work out good solutions. We might get some helpful ideas from a famous problem solver of the Old Testament by the name of David. David could not go into the army as his brothers did because he was too young, and so he stayed at home and looked after the family sheep. But one day Father Jesse sent David to King Saul's camp to take his brother some food. When he arrived, the camp was a scene of great confusion. A giant from Gath by the name of Goliath was challenging Saul's soldiers to choose a champion from among them to fight Goliath and decide the war by a single combat. Everyone in Saul's camp was desperately scared. In their fear, no one was thinking about solutions, and it looked as though they would all soon be slaves to the Philistines. But David had had some experience as a problem solver. When a lion and a bear had come among his sheep, he didn't run and hide, but solved the problem by killing the lion and the bear. Seeing the confusion and the helplessness of the Israelites, David set out to help them with their problem. He went to King Saul and said, "Let no man's heart fail because of Goliath, for I will go and fight with the Philistine." Saul pointed out the danger and called attention to the fact that David was a very young man, whereas Goliath was not only a giant, he was also the champion man of war among all the Philistines. Goliath was clad in brass and carried a spear like a weaver's beam. But even so, David did not abandon himself to fear as the others had done. He said to Saul, "This uncircumcised Philistine shall be to me as the lion and the bear, for he has defied the armies of the living God." Saul tried to put his armor upon David, but David said, "I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them." Then David picked up 5 stones out of the brook, and armed with his slingshot, he went out to meet the giant. Goliath was a little surprised that this challenge had been accepted by one so young, and he began to threaten and abuse the shepherd boy. But David said to the Philistine, "Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand." I suppose that it is what you could call the faith that moves mountains, or at least the faith that kills giants. But David also had a practical program. He put a rock in his slingshot, and as he whirled it to get up momentum, he ran to meet the Philistine. And just at the right time, and in the right way, he let the rock go, and it buried itself in the forehead of Goliath. The giant fell forward on his face, and David finished the job by cutting off his head with his own sword. And the record says, "And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled." The problem had been solved, and so David delivered his brother's lunch and went back to his sheep. In passing, it is interesting to remember that David had used this slingshot before. Unlike Saul's armor, the sling had been proven, and he knew how to put enough steam behind a rock that the problem of Goliath would stay solved for a long time. One of the great lessons of the Bible is found in the story of David, the giant killer. This is one of those lessons that we most need to learn. In our day, we are not bothered with many physical giants who steal our cattle or threaten us with a sword like a weaver's beam. But just the same, there are a lot of giants that need to be slain. Like Saul's soldiers, we have a choice between being giant killers or of being their slaves. Suppose that we work out some solutions to the giant fears that are giving us the most trouble and are robbing us of our success and happiness. There are also some giant discouragements that are annihilating our industry and self-confidence. There are some giant doubts destroying our faith in God. Some of our bad habits have attained giant status and are threatening us to a life of evil servitude. What we need more than about any other thing is the courage and skill to be a giant killer. Too many cormorants that should have been gotten rid of long ago are still getting fat at our expense. An interesting thing about this situation is that everyone must kill his own giants. But certainly one of the most profitable of all undertakings is to develop our skill as problem solvers. The Sandwich Islander believed that the strength of every enemy that he overcame was added to his own strength. We know that when we overcome the giant of discouragement, our own strength is immediately increased. If by faith and study we destroy our doubts and settle our confusions, then our strength is immediately multiplied. One of the best ways to improve our ability as problem solvers is to think more about the solution and spend less time wallowing around in the problem. A fine, middle-aged couple recently came to see me about a marital problem. To begin with, they had selected each other from among all of the people in the world, and yet they couldn't get along together. They both maintained that they wanted to save their marriage. They had no other heart interests, but they seemed to dearly love to point out the problems of each other. Each made a great many accusations. One of the husband's complaints was that his wife had invited her mother to live with them. He said he didn't think that was fair. I asked him how long his mother-in-law had been in their home. His wife spoke up and said she had died more than 8 years previous. I was impressed that almost anyone could figure out a solution to their problem, but that was no matter how good the solution was, they would not be able to follow it because they were more interested in fixing the blame than in making each other happy. They insisted on wading around in the mud puddle of their problem rather than in cleaning themselves up with an answer. They had created their own giant cormoran to rob them of love, happiness, and success. I gave them each a couple of sheets of paper and asked them to do some homework by writing out a clear-cut statement of their problem and then putting down on paper as many solutions as they could think of and bring the papers back to me in a week. It is an interesting fact that there are always several solutions to every problem. There may not be several good solutions, but it develops one problem-solving ability to make one's canvas of the alternatives as complete as possible, and to be able to expertly and objectively evaluate and weigh the advantages and disadvantages of each. The problem with Saul's soldiers was that they could only think of one way to kill a giant, and that was the impossible way of running a sword through his heavy brass armor. David thought of a better way to do the job, and he had already developed the skill with a slingshot that would enable him to put his plan into operation. Many people live lives of desperation and confusion because they devote themselves to the problem instead of the answer. Because of this defect in procedure, some people can't solve even the most tiny problems. For example, some intelligent people spend a lot of time worrying about occupational success who can't get the beds off their back in the morning. They can't kill inertia, sloth, lethargy, or indifference even in themselves. They don't know how to get rid of the bad habits of caffeine, nicotine, alcohol, or overweight. We consent to be the slaves of negative thinking, evil speaking, profanity, and disbelief rather than dig a trap in front of their caves to enable us to solve the problems. We read in the Bible about people who were possessed of devils, but how much better off is one who puts himself in the clutches of an unsolved problem and permits himself to be the slave of evil, being forever tormented by some demon that he himself has created? For many years, Peter Marshall was a chaplain in the United States Senate. He used to pray, "Lord, help us to be a part of the answer, not a part of the problem." Sometimes we make a quicksand quagmire out of a problem, and then the more we struggle and accuse and fight, the deeper we sink into the difficulty. One of the worst enemies of solutions is postponement. In the Confessions of St. Augustine, he pictures himself as a flagrantly worldly and lascivious young man. He confessed that the prayer of his wild youthful days was, "O God, give me chastity and self-control, but not just yet." Referring to the Native Americans, Brigham Young once said, "It is better to feed them than to fight them." That logic may be all right for the Native Americans, but it does not help in killing giants. Little problems can become giants with very few feedings, and we must either get rid of our Goliaths or they will get rid of us. May the Lord help us to understand and practice the philosophy of problem solving, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.